The teacup shook in Ilara's hand the moment she stepped into the throne hall, and before she could steady it, hot tea splashed across the armrest and onto the bare hand of the Alpha King himself. The entire room froze. Guards near the wall straightened. A noblewoman near the front gasped and covered her mouth. Someone dropped a scroll. Everyone in that hall knew what happened to servants who harmed the king, even by accident. Nobody breathed. Ilara dropped to her knees so fast her bones ached against the stone floor. Her hands trembled as she pressed them together and bowed her head low enough that her forehead nearly touched the ground. "Forgive me," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "Forgive me, my king. I did not mean it. Please." She braced herself. She had heard the stories. A maid who broke a plate near the Western Tower had been sent away and never seen again. A servant boy who spoke out of turn during a feast had vanished before sunrise. Kings did not tolerate mistakes, and this was not a small mistake. This was scalding tea across royal skin, in front of every noble and advisor in the kingdom. But King Kale did not shout. He did not call the guards. He did not even rise from his throne with anger in his eyes. Instead there was silence, long and strange, the kind that made the air feel heavier than it should. Ilara kept her head down, waiting for the blow, waiting for the shout, waiting for hands to grab her arms and drag her away. None of that came. "Leave us," Kale said instead, his voice low and calm. The nobles exchanged glances. One advisor stepped forward as if to protest, but the king raised a single hand, and that was enough. Chairs scraped against stone. Footsteps echoed as the hall slowly emptied, until only Ilara, still kneeling and shaking, and the king remained. She did not dare look up. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She waited for him to speak, to pronounce whatever fate awaited her. "Look at me," he said. She lifted her eyes slowly, carefully, as though even that small motion might be the thing that finally angered him. His face was not twisted in rage. His golden eyes, the eyes of an alpha, studied her with something she could not name. Not fury. Not amusement. Something closer to curiosity. "You are trembling," he said. "I am sorry, my king. I did not mean any harm. I did not ask for an apology." He rose from his throne, tall and broad, his presence filling the hall even though it had emptied of everyone else. "I asked why you are trembling." Ilara swallowed. Her hands, still pressed together, would not stop shaking. "Because I burned you," she said. "Because I know what happens to those who..." "What happens to those who make mistakes?" he asked, finishing her sentence in a tone that was almost gentle. "Is that what you believe of me?" She did not answer. She could not. To answer honestly would be dangerous, and to lie to an alpha king, one who could likely smell dishonesty the way ordinary people smelled rain before a storm, felt just as dangerous. He stepped down from the raised platform where his throne sat, moving toward her with unhurried steps. She flinched despite herself, and he stopped several feet away, giving her space, watching her the way one might watch a wounded animal that did not yet trust an outstretched hand. "Your hand is burned," she said suddenly, desperate to change the subject, to focus on anything except her own fear. "Let me fetch a healer. Please, my king, let me make this right. It is a small burn. It will heal within the hour," Kale said. "I am more concerned with something else." Her stomach tightened. "What is that?" He tilted his head slightly, and though she could not see it, she felt his gaze travel to her neck, where her collar sat higher than most servants wore theirs. She had always worn it that way. It was not fashion. It was necessity. "Your collar," he said. "Why do you wear it so high?" Her hand rose instinctively to her throat, fingers brushing against the fabric as though she could press it even higher, hide even more. "It is only how I prefer to dress, my king." "You flinch when anyone reaches near your neck," he said. It was not a question. "I noticed it the first week you began serving in this hall. You flinch even when a breeze moves your hair." Ilara's mouth went dry. She had thought she hid it well. She had thought months of careful movement, of turning her head just so, of stepping back before anyone could get too close, had been enough to keep her secret buried. Apparently, an alpha king noticed things that ordinary men did not. "It is nothing," she said quietly. "Please, my king, may I be excused? I understand if you wish to have me reassigned. I will not serve tea again if that displeases you." "I did not say I wished you reassigned." She blinked. "You don't." "No." He studied her for another long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened at the edges, though his eyes remained sharp and watchful. "You spill tea because your hands shake. Your hands shake because you are afraid. You are not afraid of spilling tea. You are afraid of something else, something that has followed you long before you ever stepped into this hall." Ilara's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her this plainly, this directly, especially not someone with the power to end her life with a single word to his guts. She did not know whether to feel terrified or strangely, dangerously understood. "You do not know me," she said, quieter now. "No," he agreed. "But I intend to." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they should have been for such a simple sentence. Ilara did not know what to make of them. Kings did not speak this way to mates. Kings did not kneel down, which he did now, lowering himself so that he was eye level with her, still keeping his distance, still giving her the space she clearly needed. "You may rise," he said gently. She rose slowly, legs unsteady beneath her, and stood with her head bowed, unable to meet his gaze directly for more than a few seconds at a time. "Ilara," he said, and she stuttered slightly, surprised he knew her name. "That is your name, is it not? I have heard the other servants call you that." "Yes, my king." "Ilara," he repeated, as though testing how the name felt. "You will not be punished for what happened today. You will not be reassigned. You will not be dismissed." Relief flooded through her so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled again, this time from the release of fear rather than the fear itself. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, my king. I promise I will be more careful." "I will not." "There is one thing I ask of you in return," he said. Her relief cuddled slightly into fresh worry. "What is that, my king?" "That you stop looking at me as though I am about to strike you." His voice was low, steady, and there was something almost sad in it, though she could not understand why a king as powerful as Kale would sound sad about anything. "I am not the kind of alpha who harms those weaker than himself. I never have been." She wanted to believe him. Every instinct told her that kings lied, that power corrupted even the gentlest intentions, that kindness shown once could vanish the moment it became inconvenient. But something in his voice, low and rough and utterly sincere, made the words settle differently than she expected. "I will try," she said finally, because it was the only honest thing she could offer. "That is enough," he said. "For now." He rose to his full height again, and the moment shifted, the strange intimacy of it fading back into something more formal, more befitting a king and a servant standing in an empty hall. "Return to your duties," he said. "I will have the healer look at your hands as well. I noticed the tea burned you too." She glanced down at her own hands, and indeed, red marks bloomed across her fingers where the scalding liquid had splashed back onto her skin during the spill. She had been so consumed with fear for her life that she had not even registered her own pain. "That is not necessary, my king." It was not a request, he said, though his tone remained gentle rather than commanding. "Go to the healer. Then return to your chambers and rest for the remainder of the day. But my duties will be covered by another servant today." He turned back toward his throne, though he paused before sitting, glancing at her one final time. "I will see you tomorrow, Ilara." There was something in the way he said her name, something that made her chest tighten in a way she did not understand and was not entirely sure she wanted to understand. She curtsied quickly, murmured her thanks again, and hurried from the hall before he could see whatever expression had crossed her face. Outside, in the corridor, she pressed her back against the cool stone wall and finally allowed herself to breathe properly for the first time since the tea had spilled. Her heart still raced, though now for entirely different reasons than fear of punishment. She had expected anger. She had expected cruelty, or at the very least the cold indifference that came from those in power when dealing with those who served them. She had not expected kindness. She had certainly not expected curiosity, the kind that made her wonder, uneasily, what exactly the Alpha King intended when he said he wished to know her. As she made her way toward the healer's quarters, her fingers brushed against her collar again, an old habit, a nervous tick she had carried for years. She thought of the marks hidden beneath the fabric, the ones she never let anyone see, the ones that told a story she had buried as deep as she could manage. She wondered, with a shiver that had nothing to do with cold, whether King Kale already suspected more than he had let on. And she wondered why, despite every warning bell ringing in her mind, some small and foolish part of her almost wanted him to ask again. 3 days passed before Ilara saw the king again, and in those 3 days she convinced herself that the strange encounter in the throne hall had been nothing more than a passing moment of royal mercy, the kind kings sometimes granted to remind themselves they were capable of it. She told herself he would forget her name by the end of the week. She told herself the curiosity in his eyes had been nothing more than idle interest, gone as quickly as it appeared. She was wrong. On the 4th morning, a steward found her in the servants' quarters while she folded linens, his face pinched with the particular tightness of someone delivering unwelcome news. "The king has requested you," the steward said. Privately. In his study. Ilara's hand stilled over the linens. "Me? Are you certain there is no mistake? He asked for you by name." "Ilara." He was quite specific. The steward's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicious in the way that people became suspicious of servants who received unusual attention from those above them. "I would advise you to hurry. Kings do not enjoy waiting." She hurried, smoothing her apron and tucking loose strands of hair back into place as she walked, her mind racing through every possible reason he might summon her. Perhaps he had reconsidered his mercy. Perhaps 3 days had given him time to remember that servants who spilled tea on royalty should not go unpunished, regardless of how calm he had seemed in the moment. By the time she reached the heavy wooden doors of his private study, her heart hammered so hard she feared he might hear it before she even knocked. "Enter," came his voice from within, before she had even raised her hand to the door. She stepped inside, and the room swallowed her immediately in its scale and warmth. Shelves lined every wall, filled with books and scrolls and strange artifacts she did not recognize. A fire crackled in a hearth larger than the entire kitchen she worked in, and the king sat behind a heavy desk, a quill in hand, parchment spread before him. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression eased, as though her presence had answered some question he had been considering. "Close the door," he said. She did, though her hand lingered on the handle a moment longer than necessary, some instinct telling her that closed doors and private studies were not places where servants typically found safety. "You wish to see me, my king?" "I did." He set down his quill and gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit." "I would prefer to stand, if it pleases you." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, as though understanding some unspoken reason behind her preference. "As you wish." Silence stretched between them, and Ilara shifted uncomfortably, unsure what was expected of her, unsure why she had been summoned if not for punishment or reprimand. "I have been thinking about our conversation," Kale said finally. "The tea, my king?" "No." He rose from his desk, moving with the same unhurried grace she remembered from the throne hall, though this time there was no distance between them but the width of the room. "I have been thinking about you." Her breath caught, and she took an involuntary step backward, her shoulders brushing against the closed door. "My king, I do not understand what you—" "I mean no harm by it," he said quickly, noticing her retreat, stopping his own approach immediately. "Forgive me. I forget sometimes how my words might sound to those who do not know my intentions." "What are your intentions?" she asked, and the question came out braver than she felt. He seemed to consider this carefully, as though the answer required more thought than she expected a king to give to a servant. "I do not entirely know," he admitted. "I only know that since the day you spilled tea across my hand, I have found myself unable to stop wondering about the fear in your eyes." It was not the fear of a servant who worries about punishment. It was something older. Something deeper. Ilara's throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that he was mistaken, that there was nothing beneath the surface worth his royal curiosity. But something about his gaze, steady and patient and utterly without judgment, made lying feel almost impossible. "You cannot know that," she said instead, choosing evasion over outright denial. "Perhaps not with certainty," he agreed. "But I have lived long enough, and seen enough pain in others, to recognize it when it stands before me." She said nothing, her fingers unconsciously rising to brush against her collar once more, the old nervous habit betraying her before she could stop it. Cale's eyes followed the motion, and something flickered across his face, something between understanding and restrained anger, though she sensed instinctively that whatever anger lived in him was not directed at her. "Someone hurt you," he said quietly. It was not a question. "My king, I would rather not." "You do not have to tell me," he interrupted gently. "I am not commanding you to share your past. I would never demand such a thing from anyone, least of all someone who already carries so much weight in silence." Relief and something else, something warmer and more confusing, mixed together in her chest. "Then why did you summon me?" "Because I wanted you to know that you are safe here," he said. "Whatever happened before you came to this castle, whoever caused you to flinch at every unexpected touch, they cannot reach you within these walls. I will not allow it." Ilara stared at him, searching his face for the lie she was certain must exist somewhere beneath his words. Kings did not make such promises to mates. Kings did not concern themselves with the fears of servants who spilled tea and trembled at shadows. And yet, looking into his golden eyes, she found no deception there, only a steady and unwavering sincerity that unsettled her more than any cruelty could have. "Why do you care?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "I am nothing to you. A servant. One among dozens who pour your tea and clean your halls. Why would an alpha king concern himself with my fears?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the fire before returning to her. "I have asked myself the same question," he said. "I do not have a satisfying answer. I only know that something in me responded to you the moment you knelt on that floor, certain I was about to end your life, and yet still finding the courage to look up and meet my eyes rather than cower entirely." "I was terrified," she admitted. "And yet you looked at me anyway." His voice softened further. "That kind of courage is rare, Ilara. Rarer than you might think." She did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever called her brave. She had spent years believing herself weak, believing that the scars hidden beneath her collar marked her as damaged, as lesser, as someone who had failed to protect herself when it mattered most. To hear a king, of all people, speak of courage in connection with her name felt almost impossible to accept. "I should return to my duties," she said instead, deflecting the moment before it could grow any heavier. "Of course." He stepped back, giving her space, though his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the distance between them. "But Ilara, before you go, I would ask one thing of you." "What is that, my king?" "Do not fear me," he said simply. "Whatever fear lives inside you because of your past, do not let it color how you see me. I know I cannot ask this easily, given how the world has likely treated you, but I would ask it nonetheless." She hesitated, her hand on the door handle, torn between the instinct to flee and the strange, unfamiliar pull to remain, to understand more about this king who spoke so differently than every cruel figure who had shaped her past. "I will try," she said, echoing the same promise she had given him days before. "That is enough," he said again, and there was something almost like relief in his voice. She left the study quickly after that, her mind spinning with questions she could not answer and feelings she did not know how to name. The following days blurred together in a strange new rhythm. She still served tea, still cleaned halls, still moved through her duties with the same quiet efficiency she always had. But now, wherever the king was present, she found herself acutely aware of him, of the way his eyes tracked her movements, of the careful distance he maintained even as something unspoken grew between them. He began finding reasons to speak with her. A question about her preferences for meals. A comment about the weather as she passed through the courtyard. Small, insignificant exchanges that meant nothing on their own but accumulated into something that felt, disturbingly, like the beginning of a friendship she had never expected to have with someone so far above her station. One evening, Nearly 2 weeks after the tea incident, she found herself alone in the corridor outside his private chambers, having been sent to deliver a message from the head steward. As she turned to leave after knocking and receiving no answer, a hand caught her wrist gently from behind. She spun around, heart latching, every old instinct screaming at her to pull away, to run, to protect herself from whatever threat her mind conjured in that instant of contact. But it was only Cale, his expression immediately apologetic, his hand releasing her wrist the moment he saw the flash of panic in her eyes. "Forgive me," he said quickly. "I did not mean to startle you. I called your name, but you did not seem to hear me." Ilara pressed a hand to her chest, willing her racing heart to slow. "It is all right, my king. I simply was not expecting to be touched." Something in her phrasing seemed to catch his attention, and his expression shifted into something more contemplative, more careful. "You truly do fear touch," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Not all touch," she said before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted the admission, unsure why she had offered even that small piece of truth. "What kind of touch, then, do you fear?" he asked, his voice gentle, careful not to push too hard, though the question itself pressed against something raw inside her. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, her fingers rising once more to her collar in that familiar, betraying gesture. "The kind that comes without warning," she said finally. "The kind that reminds me of things I would rather forget." Cale did not press further, though she could see the questions building behind his eyes, questions he clearly wanted to ask but restrained himself from voicing. Instead, he simply nodded, as though her answer, incomplete as it was, told him enough to understand the shape of her pain even without the specific details. "Thank you for telling me that much," he said. "I will remember it." She nodded, uncertain what else to say, and excused herself quickly, retreating down the corridor with her heart still unsteady, though for entirely different reasons than it had been in the throne hall weeks before. That night, lying in her small servant's chamber, she found herself thinking not of the fear that had defined so much of her life, but of the careful way Cale had released her wrist the moment he sensed her discomfort, of the patience in his voice as he asked about her fears without ever demanding she reveal more than she was ready to share. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to trust someone again. The thought terrified her almost as much as it comforted her, and she fell asleep uncertain which feeling would ultimately win. Autumn arrived slowly across the castle grounds, painting the courtyard trees in shades of amber and rust, and with it came a shift in Ilara's duties that she had not anticipated. The head steward, without explanation, reassigned her from general hall service to the king's personal quarters, a position reserved typically for the most trusted and experienced servants in the castle. "Why me?" she asked, standing before the steward's desk, her confusion plain on her face. "I have served here barely half a year. Surely there are others more suited to such a role." "The king requested you specifically," the steward said, not looking up from his ledger, his tone carrying the particular weariness of someone who had long since stopped questioning the decisions of those above him. "I do not ask why. Neither should you." And so Ilara found herself, day after day, moving through the private wing of the castle reserved for King Cale alone, bringing his meals, tending his fire, arranging fresh linens in rooms far grander than anything she had ever imagined entering, let alone serving within. At first, the proximity unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Every creak of a door, every unexpected sound in the quiet hallways, sent small jolts of alarm through her body, old habits refusing to release their grip despite weeks of gentle reassurance from the king himself. But slowly, gradually, something in her began to soften. Cale was patient with her in ways she had never experienced from anyone in a position of power. He never raised his voice, even when she fumbled with unfamiliar tasks. He never demanded more of her than she could give. And more than anything, he seemed to notice, with an unsettling precision, exactly when she needed space and exactly when a quiet word of encouragement might ease her nerves. One evening in late autumn, she brought his evening meal to his private study, expecting to find him at his desk as usual, buried in scrolls and correspondence. Instead, she found him standing near the window, watching the last light of sunset fade over the distant hills, his expression distant and unreadable. "My king," she said softly, unsure whether to disturb his thoughts. He turned, and something in his face eased when he saw her, a small but genuine warmth replacing the distant look he had worn moments before. "Ilara. Thank you for bringing this." She set the tray down on a side table near his desk, careful and precise, and turned to leave as she always did once her task was complete. But his voice stopped her before she reached the door. "Stay a moment," he said. "If you are willing." She hesitated, torn between the instinct to simply complete her duties and retreat, and the strange curiosity that had grown steadily within her over the weeks of careful conversations and small kindnesses. "Of course, my king." He gestured toward the 2 chairs near the fireplace, and though every instinct told her that sitting with a king as an equal was improper, something in his expression made refusal feel unnecessary. She sat, perched carefully on the edge of the chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You seem troubled tonight," she observed, surprising herself with the boldness of the comment. Cale studied her for a moment before answering, as though weighing how much honesty to offer. "The council grows restless," he admitted. "There are those among my advisors who believe I spend too much time on matters that do not concern the kingdom's affairs." "Matters such as what?" she asked, though something in his tone made her suspect she already knew. "Matters such as the well-being of a single servant," he said quietly, his golden eyes finding hers across the small distance between their chairs. "They believe my attention should remain solely on matters of state, not on ensuring the comfort of one maid among many." Ilara's cheeks warmed, and she looked away, uncertain how to respond to such a direct admission. "You should not concern yourself with me at the expense of your duties, my king. I am capable of managing my own comfort." "Perhaps," he said. "But that does not mean I wish to stop." The words hung between them, heavier than casual conversation should allow, and Ilara found herself unable to look away from him despite every instinct urging caution. The firelight cast soft shadows across his face, softening the sharp angles that usually made him appear so formidable, so untouchable. "May I ask you something?" he said after a long moment of silence. "You may ask," she said carefully. "I cannot promise an answer." "Fair enough." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression open and honest in a way that made her chest tighten with something she did not want to name. "The scar on your neck. I have seen the edge of it, beneath your collar, though you hide it well. I have never asked you to explain it, and I will not ask now either. But I want you to know that whatever caused it, whatever pain lives beneath that fabric, it does not change how I see you." Her hand rose instinctively to her collar, the old defensive gesture returning without thought. "You do not know what it means," she said quietly. "You do not know what it represents." "You are right," he said. "I do not know. But I know that you carry it as though it makes you less worthy of kindness, less deserving of gentleness, and I want you to understand that this is not true. Whatever happened to you, it was not your failure. It was something done to you, not something you chose." Tears pricked unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let herself unravel in front of him, unwilling to reveal the depth of the wound his words had touched. "You cannot know that," she whispered. "I know enough," he said gently. "I know the way you flinch. I know the way you hide. I know the way you brace yourself for cruelty even when none has been offered. These are not the reactions of someone who chose their pain, Ilara. These are the reactions of someone who survived something they never should have had to endure." She could not respond, her throat too tight with emotion to form words, and for a long moment they simply sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between them, filling the space where speech had failed. "May I show you something?" Cale asked eventually, his voice careful, deliberate, as though testing whether she would allow him closer. She nodded, though uncertainty still coiled tight in her stomach. He rose slowly from his chair, moving with the same unhurried grace that always accompanied his approach toward her, and knelt before her chair rather than standing over her, placing himself lower, less threatening, giving her every opportunity to retreat if she needed to. "I am not going to hurt you," he said softly. "I only wish to show you something. If at any point you wish me to stop, you need only say so, and I will." Her heart pounded, though not entirely from fear this time. There was something else mixed into the rapid rhythm of her pulse, something warmer and more confusing than the old familiar terror she had carried for years. He reached up slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and gently, carefully, drew back the edge of her collar just enough to reveal the pale, jagged scar that stretched across the side of her neck, the mark she had spent years hiding beneath high fabric and careful posture. Ilara held perfectly still, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, watching his face for any sign of disgust, any flicker of the horror she had always imagined would cross someone's expression upon seeing the mark she carried. Instead, his golden eyes softened further, filled with something that looked almost like reverence, and before she could react, before she could pull away or brace herself, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently, softly, against the very center of the scar. The kiss was not demanding. It was not the kind of touch she had spent years fearing, the kind that came without warning and left pain in its wake. It was slow, deliberate, careful, a question rather than a claim, though something in the tenderness of it felt like a promise all the same. Ilara's breath shuddered out of her, and she found herself frozen not from fear but from the overwhelming rush of emotion that flooded through her at the unexpected gentleness of the gesture. No one had ever touched that scar with anything but pity or disgust. No one had ever treated it as though it were simply another part of her, worthy of the same tenderness as any other. Cale pulled back slowly, his eyes searching her face, watching for any sign that he had overstepped, that he had asked too much of her trust too quickly. "Ilara," he said softly. "Are you all right?" She could not answer immediately, her emotions too tangled to sort into words. Tears finally spilled over, tracing down her cheeks, and Cale's expression shifted instantly into concern, his hand rising as though to comfort her before he caught himself, uncertain whether such a touch would be welcome. "I did not mean to distress you," he said quickly. "If I overstepped, You did not overstep," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. No one has ever looked at it without flinching. No one has ever touched it without treating me as though I were something broken." "You are not broken," Cale said firmly, his voice carrying a conviction that settled something deep and aching within her chest. "You are someone who survived. There is a difference, Ilara, and I hope one day you will believe it as fully as I do." She wiped at her tears, embarrassed by the display of emotion, though something in his steady presence made the embarrassment feel smaller than it might have otherwise. "Why do you care so much?" she asked again, the same question she had asked weeks before, though now it carried different weight, different urgency. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers, before he finally answered. "Because somewhere between the tea spilling across my hand and this very moment, I stopped seeing you as simply a servant in my castle," he said. "I began seeing you as someone I wished to know fully, scars and fears and all. I do not fully understand why my instincts have drawn me toward you so strongly, but I no longer wish to fight against it." The confession hung in the air between them, heavier than anything spoken before, and Ilara found herself at a crossroads she had never expected to face. Every rational part of her mind screamed caution, reminded her of the vast difference in their stations, warned her of the danger inherent in allowing a king's affection to take root in her heart. But another part of her, quieter and more insistent, whispered that perhaps, for the first time since the scar had been carved into her skin, she might be allowed to feel safe again. "I do not know how to trust easily," she admitted quietly. "It has been taken from me before, and rebuilding it is difficult." "I understand," Cale said. "I will not ask you to trust me completely, not yet. I only ask that you allow me the chance to earn it, slowly, in whatever way you need." She looked at him then, really looked at him, past the crown and the title and the power that separated their words, and saw simply a man kneeling before her, patient and sincere, offering something she had never expected to receive again. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like the chance to trust you." Something in his expression brightened at her words, relief and hope mingling together in a way that made him look younger, less burdened by the weight of his crown. "Then we will move at whatever pace you need," he said. "I am in no hurry, Ilara. I have waited this long already. I can wait longer still." They remained by the fire for a while longer, the conversation drifting into gentler territory, small stories about her childhood before the scar, small stories about his own burdens as a young alpha thrust into leadership before he felt ready for it. It was the first time she had spoken so freely with anyone in years, and something in the ease of it left her both exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. When she finally rose to return to her quarters for the night, Cale walked her to the door of his study, his hand hovering near the small of her back without quite touching, a careful gesture of respect for the boundaries they had only just begun to navigate. "Good night, Ilara," he said softly. "Good night, my king," she replied, though the former title felt strange on her tongue now, after everything that had passed between them. As she walked back through the quiet corridors toward her small chamber, her fingers rose once more to her collar, though this time the gesture carried none of its usual fear. Instead, she found herself simply resting her fingers against the fabric, remembering the warmth of his lips against a mark she had spent years believing made her unlovable. For the first time since the night the scar had been carved into her skin, she allowed herself to imagine a future where that pain no longer defined her, where instead it became simply one part of a story that included kindness, patience, and the growing, terrifying possibility of love. She did not know what the following weeks would bring, whether the court would accept a king's affection for a human maid, whether the whispers already beginning to spread through the castle halls would grow into something more dangerous. But that night, walking beneath the quiet moonlight of the castle grounds, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. The whispers began within days, spreading through the castle corridors faster than Ilara could have anticipated. Servants exchanged glances when she passed. Nobles who once ignored her entirely now watched her with sharp, assessing eyes whenever she entered a room. The head steward grew colder toward her, his instructions clipped and his patience thin, as though her sudden closeness to the king had transformed her from an invisible maid into a threat requiring careful management. "They are talking about you, Mira," one of the younger kitchen maids and the closest thing Ilara had to a friend within the castle walls, whispered one afternoon as they folded linens together in the laundry room. "About you and the king. About how he requested you specifically for his private quarters. About how you were seen leaving his study late at night." "Nothing improper happened," Ilara said quickly, though heat rose in her cheeks at the memory of the kiss pressed against her scar, gentle and reverent and unlike anything she had ever experienced. "I did not say it did," Mira replied, her eyes kind but knowing. "But you should be careful, Ilara. The nobles do not take kindly to a king favoring someone beneath their station, especially someone human. There are those in this castle who would see you removed simply for daring to catch his attention." Ilara said nothing, though the warning settled uneasily in her stomach, a reminder that whatever fragile happiness she had begun building with Kale existed within a world that had never been kind to people like her, people without wealth or status or the protection that came from noble blood. The confirmation of Myra's warning came only a week later, during a formal gathering in the Great Hall where visiting dignitaries from a neighboring territory had come to discuss trade agreements. Ilara had been assigned to serve refreshments alongside several other maids, careful and quiet as always, moving through the crowd of nobles with practiced invisibility. She noticed him before he approached her, a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes, one of the kingdom's most influential council members, a man named Adrian who had never bothered to acknowledge her presence in the months she had served within the castle walls. Now his gaze followed her deliberately as she moved between guests, and something in his expression made her skin prickle with unease. "You are the maid the king has taken such interest in," Adrian said, stepping into her path as she attempted to pass with a tray of refreshments. His voice carried just enough volume to draw the attention of nearby guests, though not so loud as to seem improper in the formal setting. "I serve within the castle, my lord," she replied carefully, keeping her eyes lowered in the manner expected of servants addressing nobility. "I am not certain what interest you refer to." "Do not play the innocent with me," Adrian said, his tone sharpening despite the pleasant smile he maintained for the benefit of watching eyes. "The entire court knows of your private meetings with King Kale. Some believe you have bewitched him somehow, used some manner of trickery to earn his favor." "I have done nothing of the sort," Ilara said, though her voice trembled slightly under the weight of his accusation. "Perhaps not deliberately," Adrian considered, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "But regardless of intention, a human maid holding the attention of an alpha king threatens the stability of this kingdom. Our people expect their king to choose a mate of proper standing, someone who strengthens our alliances, not a servant with no family, no status, and by the look of that scar peeking above your collar, no small amount of hidden history." Ilara's blood ran cold, her hand instinctively rising to adjust her collar, though the damage of his observation had already been made. Adrian's eyes glinted with satisfaction at her reaction, as though he had confirmed some suspicion he had long harbored. Whatever happened to you before you arrived here, he continued, his voice dropping lower, meant only for her ears now. I imagine it is not a story our king would wish associated with his throne. Perhaps you should consider, for your own sake as much as his, returning to whatever life you led before you caught his attention. Before Ilara could formulate a response, a familiar voice cut through the tension with quiet, unmistakable authority. Is there a problem here? Both Ilara and Edrin turned to find Kale standing behind them, his expression calm on the surface but his golden eyes burning with a controlled intensity that made even the confident council member take an involuntary step backward. My king, Edrin said, recovering his composure quickly, though not quickly enough to hide the flicker of alarm that had crossed his face. I was simply making conversation with your maid. It did not appear to be simple conversation, Kale said, his voice deceptively calm, though Ilara could sense the barely restrained tension caught beneath his words. It appeared to be something closer to an interrogation. I was merely expressing concerns shared by many within the court, Edrin said, straightening his shoulders, clearly unwilling to back down entirely despite the king's evident displeasure. Concerns about the appropriateness of your attention toward a human servant of unknown background. Her background is not your concern, Kale said, his voice hardening slightly, though he kept his tone even, controlled. Nor is my attention toward her a matter requiring the council's approval. With respect, my king, matters of succession and alliance are precisely the council's concern, Edrin pressed, emboldened perhaps by the presence of watching guests, unwilling to appear as though he had been dismissed without argument. A human maid, regardless of her personal qualities, cannot offer the kingdom what a proper mate of noble standing might provide. The surrounding guests had grown quiet now, many pretending to continue their own conversations while clearly straining to hear every word of the exchange unfolding before them. Ilara wished desperately for the ground to swallow her whole, humiliation and fear tangling together in her chest as she stood frozen between the two powerful men. This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion, Kale said finally, his voice carrying a note of finality that even Edrin seemed to recognize as a command rather than a suggestion. We will discuss council matters during proper session, not during a diplomatic gathering meant to honor our guest. Edrin bowed stiffly, though his eyes remained cold as they flicked once more toward Ilara before he retreated back into the crowd of gathered nobles. Kale watched him go, his jaw tight, before turning his attention to Ilara, his expression softening immediately at the sight of her visible distress. Are you all right? He asked quietly, careful to keep his voice low enough that only she could hear. I should return to my duties, she said, her voice unsteady, desperate to escape the weight of dozens of curious eyes still lingering on their exchange. Ilara. He said her name gently, though there was something pleading in it, something that made her pause despite every instinct urging her to flee. I am sorry you were subjected to that. I should have intervened sooner. It is not your fault, she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Lord Edrin is not wrong. I am not the kind of woman a king should associate himself with, not openly. My presence at your side only invites this sort of trouble. Do not say that, Kale said, his voice firm now, though still gentle. You are not trouble, Ilara. You are someone worth defending, and I intend to make that clear to anyone who suggests otherwise. At what cost? She asked, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes despite her determination not to cry in front of the watching court. Your counsel already questions your judgment because of me. What happens when that questioning turns into something more dangerous, something that threatens your throne? Kale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest ache with the weight of unspoken emotion. Let me worry about my throne, he said finally. You need only worry about whether you wish to remain by my side despite the difficulties it may bring. She did not answer immediately, torn between the growing feelings she could no longer deny and the very real fear of what those feelings might cause them both. But before she could formulate a response, a commotion near the entrance of the hall drew everyone's attention. Guards entered, escorting a woman Ilara did not recognize, someone dressed in traveling clothes rather than court finery, her expression tense and urgent as she scanned the crowded room until her eyes landed on Ilara herself. That is her, the woman said loudly, pointing directly at Ilara, her voice cutting through the murmur of the gathered crowd. That is the girl who fled from Lord Voss's estate 3 years ago. The one marked as property, the one who ran before her branding was complete. The words hit Ilara like a physical blow, the color draining from her face as decades of careful hiding threatened to unravel in a single, devastating moment before the entire court. "What is the meaning of this?" Cale demanded, his voice sharp with sudden alertness, his body angling protectively between Ilara and the approaching woman without conscious thought. "I am simply here to reclaim what rightfully belongs to my employer," the woman said, her chin lifting with cold confidence. "This girl escaped before her indenture was complete. She carries the mark to prove it, hidden beneath that collar she always wears so carefully. Lord Voss has searched for her for years." The entire hall had gone utterly silent now, every eye fixed on Ilara, whose trembling hands rose instinctively to protect the scar the woman had just exposed to the entire gathered court, the secret she had guarded so carefully now laid bare before nobles, dignitaries, and the king whose affection she had only just begun to trust. "Is this true?" Cale asked quietly, turning to face her, his expression unreadable in the sudden tension of the moment. Ilara's eyes filled with tears, humiliation and terror warring within her as she realized the story she had spent years burying was about to be dragged into the light before everyone she had come to care for. "My king," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, let me explain." Cale's expression did not shift toward the suspicion or judgment Ilara feared. Instead, he stepped closer to her, his presence a steady wall between her trembling body and the woman who had just torn her carefully guarded secret into the open air of the great hall. "You do not owe an explanation to anyone in this room," Cale said quietly, though his voice carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear. Then, turning to the stranger, his tone hardened into something commanding. "Who are you, and by what authority do you enter my hall making such accusations?" "I serve Lord Voss of the Eastern Territories," the woman said, though her earlier confidence wavered slightly under the weight of the king's cold attention. "This girl fled his estate before completing an indenture contract. She bears the mark of an incomplete branding as proof." "Show me this mark," Cale said, "and show me the contract that supposedly binds her." The woman hesitated, clearly not having anticipated being asked for proof rather than simply having her word accepted. "The contract remains with Lord Voss," she said. "But the mark speaks for itself." "A scar," Cale said flatly, "does not constitute legal proof of ownership. It constitutes proof that someone caused her harm, nothing more." He turned to Ilara, his golden eyes softening as they met her own, silently asking permission before he spoke further. "Ilara, will you tell me what happened?" "Only if you wish to." Ilara took a shaking breath, aware of dozens of eyes fixed upon her, aware that whatever she said next would likely determine not only her own fate but potentially the stability of the kingdom she had come to think of as safety. But something in Cale's steady presence beside her, the way he had positioned himself protectively without demanding she explain herself, gave her the courage to finally speak the truth she had buried for 3 long years. "When I was younger, my family fell into debt neither my parents nor I could repay," she began, her voice unsteady but growing stronger with each word. "Lord Voss offered what seemed like mercy, a position within his household that would clear the debt within a decade of service. I did not understand, not fully, what such a contract truly meant until I arrived at his estate and discovered that indentured servants there were treated as property rather than people, marked permanently to prevent escape and to remind them of their bondage." She paused, her hand rising instinctively to her collar, though this time she did not stop the motion, did not hide the mark any longer. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled the fabric aside, revealing the jagged scar to the entire assembled court. "I ran before the branding was finished," she continued, her voice growing steadier despite the tremor beneath it. "I ran because I could not bear the thought of a lifetime of servitude marked into my very skin, treated as though I were livestock rather than a person. I have spent 3 years hiding, terrified that someone would find me and drag me back to that life." The hall remained utterly silent, the weight of her confession settling over the gathered nobles and dignitaries like a heavy fog. Ilara braced herself for judgment, for condemnation, for the inevitable moment when the court would decide that a runaway servant, marked and haunted, did not deserve protection within these walls. Instead, Cale turned toward the woman who had made the accusation, his expression darkening with a fury Ilara had never witnessed in him before. "Indentured servitude that involves permanent marking against the will of the servant is not merely unethical," he said, his voice carrying a cold authority that silenced any murmurs rippling through the crowd. "It is illegal under the laws of this kingdom, laws established generations ago specifically to prevent such abuses. Lord Voss operates within the boundaries of his own territory, the woman protested, though her confidence had crumbled entirely now beneath the weight of the king's evident anger. His practices have gone unquestioned for years. Then those years of neglect end today, Chenal said firmly. You will return to your master and inform him that any further attempt to reclaim Ilara, or any other servant marked against their will be treated as a direct violation of this kingdom's laws, punishable by the full authority of the crown. The woman's face paled, and she stammered a hasty acknowledgement before retreating from the hall under the watchful eyes of the guards, her earlier confidence replaced entirely by fear of the consequences she now understood awaited her employer. Once she had gone, Chenal turned back to Ilara, his expression softening from the fury he had directed at the intruder into something achingly gentle. Thank you for telling the truth, he said quietly. I know how difficult that must have been. Everyone knows now, she whispered, glancing at the gathered nobles, many of whom watched her with expressions ranging from pity to something closer to newfound respect. Everyone knows what I am. They know what was done to you, Chenal corrected gently. Not what you are. There is a significant difference, Ilara, and I hope you will come to understand that difference as clearly as I do. Lord Edrin, who had watched the entire exchange with narrowed, calculating eyes, stepped forward once more, though his earlier confidence had visibly diminished in the wake of the king's display of protective fury. My king, he said carefully, surely this incident only reinforces the concerns I raised earlier. A servant with such a troubled history, haunted by outside parties, brings unwanted attention and instability to your court. On the contrary, Chenal said, his voice carrying renewed strength as he turned to address not only Edrin but the entire assembled gathering. This incident demonstrates precisely why Ilara belongs within these walls, protected by the full authority of this crown. She survived cruelty that would have broken many others, fled from bondage at great personal risk, and has served this castle with quiet dignity ever since, despite carrying wounds that most in this room could not imagine enduring. He turned to face Ilara directly now, his golden eyes filled with a warmth and determination that made her breath catch in her throat. I have spent weeks trying to understand why my instinct drew me toward you so powerfully from the very first moment you knelt trembling on my throne room floor, he said. I understand now. It was never mere curiosity. It was recognition of a strength I have rarely witnessed in anyone, human or wolf alike. Ilara's eyes filled with tears once more, though this carried none of the shame or fear that had accompanied her earlier emotion. Chenal, she said softly, using his name without title for the first time, surprising even herself with the intimacy of the address. Ilara, he replied, a small smile finally breaking through the tension that had gripped his features throughout the confrontation. He reached for her hand, and this time she did not flinch, did not pull away, but allowed her fingers to intertwine with his before the watching eyes of the entire court. I know this changes things, he said quietly, meant only for her though the surrounding silence carried his words further than perhaps he intended. I know accepting my affection publicly invites scrutiny and danger you never asked to face. But I would rather face that danger beside you than continue pretending my feelings do not exist simply to maintain a comfortable peace with those who question my judgment. And if the council refuses to accept me, she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of hope she had not allowed herself to feel so openly before. Then they will need to accept that their king has made his choice, Chenal said firmly, turning to address Edrin and the gathered nobles once more. I have watched this woman face fear, cruelty, and public humiliation with more grace and courage than many who have spent their entire lives within these privileged walls. If the council wishes to question my judgment regarding matters of the heart, they may do so. But they will not question her worth, nor will they question her place within this castle. The hall remained silent for a long moment, until finally, unexpectedly, one of the visiting dignitaries began to clap, slowly at first, then joined by others among the gathered guests, until a smattering of applause filled the space that had moments before held only tension and judgment. Even some of the castle's own nobles joined in, their earlier skepticism softening in the face of the king's unwavering conviction and Ilara's evident courage. Edrin, recognizing the shifted mood of the room, offered a stiff, reluctant bow before retreating into the crowd, though the look he cast toward Ilara before leaving suggested that his resistance had not entirely dissolved, merely retreated to wait for another opportunity. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread throughout the kingdom, and rather than diminishing Ilara's standing as Edrin had hoped, it transformed public perception of her entirely. Servants who had once regarded her with suspicion now offered quiet gestures of solidarity and respect. Nobles who had dismissed her as unworthy began to see, gradually, the resilience that Cale had recognized from the very beginning. 3 months later, on a bright spring morning with the castle gardens in full bloom, Cale stood before the assembled court, Ilara at his side, and made an announcement that sent ripples of astonishment and delight through the gathered crowd. He would take Ilara as his chosen mate, not in secrecy or shame, but in full ceremony, declaring before the entire kingdom that scars, past, and humble origins meant nothing when weighed against the strength and grace of the woman who had captured his heart. The ceremony itself was simple by royal standards, though no less meaningful for its modesty. Ilara wore a gown the color of soft autumn amber, her collar for the first time in years lowered enough to reveal the scar she had once hidden with such desperate shame, now worn openly as a testament to the survival that had brought her to this moment. As Cale claimed her before the court, his lips finding hers in a kiss that carried none of the tentative gentleness of their first intimate moment together but instead blazed with the full confidence of a promise fulfilled, Ilara felt the last remnants of her old fear finally dissolve entirely. The maid who had once trembled on her knees, certain that a single spilled cup of tea would cost her everything, now stood as the most protected and cherished woman in the entire kingdom. Her scars, once a source of shame and secrecy, had become instead a symbol of everything she had overcome, everything she had survived, and everything that had ultimately led her into the arms of a king who saw her not despite her past, but because of the strength that past had forged within her. As the celebration continued long into the evening, music and laughter filling the castle grounds, Ilara found a quiet moment alone with Cale near the edge of the gardens, away from the noise and celebration, just the two of them beneath a sky beginning to fill with early evening stars. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked softly, leaning into the warmth of his embrace. "Only one," he said, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "What is that?" "That it took a spilled cup of tea to finally bring you into my life," he said. "I only wish I had found you sooner." Ilara laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised even herself with its lightness. "Perhaps," she said, "some things simply happen exactly when they are meant to." Cale pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, then, gently, to the scar along her neck that had once represented everything she feared and now represented everything she had overcome. "Then I am grateful," he said quietly, "for every difficult step that led you here, to me." And beneath the darkening sky, surrounded by the quiet peace of a kingdom that had finally accepted her as their own, Ilara allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to believe that she had finally found the safety and belonging she had spent so many years searching for.